What if you've driven past Lake George, Wirrawat, recently, or even not actually that recently, because it's very, very full state. Has been the case for a while now. It's so exciting. I don't know about you. It's so exciting to see the lake full of water. But it's not just full with water, of course. You might have noticed a pod of pelicans, a bank of black swans gliding around the water's edge. There are increasing numbers of birds flying in for a bit of a spring break. It has local birdwatchers, as you might expect, in a flap. No one more so than the president of the Canberra Ornithologist Group, Neil Hermes, who joins me this afternoon. G'day, Neil. How are you?
Anna, I cannot believe that you introduced me with a line like "got me in a flap." How can you do that?
I have to pay full credit to the fabulous Natalie Larkins for that one, but it was too good not to use.
Oh, I suppose I have to give you. It's okay, but look, I mean, you're showing your age when you're so amazed by all this, because of course some of us who are a little bit older, this just happens, every decade or two, it goes up and down and up and down. When I was 12, I fished Lake George from the edge of the highway, the Sydney
Mm.
Highway. I mean, this is something that I know it's amazing and it's fantastic, but you have to see it in some sort of historical context. This is what Lake George does. And when it was named Lake George back in the early 1800s, of course, it was recognised then to be the largest lake in New South Wales. So, look, the lake comes and goes, but at the moment, you're absolutely right. It's full.
Well,
Well,
no,
getting
indeed.
full.
And it was. I remember
Yeah.
it full as a child, but I have to say it was very empty for a while there. So, what actually happens to the wildlife when it not only fills but stays full in the way that it has done over the last few years?
Okay, so look, there's swings and roundabouts in all of this, of course, because when it's grassland, it's wildlife, it's habitat for other species of wildlife. So we have, lots of reptiles, lots of eagles and hawks and quail and pitters and pivots and those sorts of species. So they've all gone, and they've been now substituted with a different group, of course, which are now the aquatic birds and the aquatic animals. So what happens is, as the lake fills, and it fills from the east across to the west, because the deepest section's over on the east where we can't see it. So it's often got water when we can't see it from the road. But one of the big factors that happens, of course, is that once it's full, the amazing amount of life that then occurs in the water, all the small insects, etc., and invertebrates, and that then feeds vast numbers of fish. And what I would be predicting over the next, right now, springtime, with the amount of water that's there now, species, particularly like the redfin carp, will be absolutely exploding in numbers in the water there, and we will have huge amounts of fish available for fish-eating birds to consume in the
Now,
lake, and that'll change things.
Now, this sounds like a real good news, bad news situation, Neil. When you're using a word like redfin carp, I'm assuming these are not native fish. Is that a
No,
correct
no,
assumption?
they were introduced back in the 1800s into Australia, and they are an exotic fish. They're a type of perch, and they're a noxious fish. They happen to be released into Lake George. They survive these long periods of dry weather. Fish will survive in muddy conditions, and the eggs will survive. So they survive in Lake George, even if there's almost no water at all. And then they expand. I mean, a female now in the middle of spring, she'll be laying thousands of eggs right now. And so, we'll have this huge surge in these exotic fish. And of course, birds like pelicans that need to eat, vast amounts of fish to survive are going to find it a plentiful supply when they rediscover Lake George.
Well, hopefully they can, dent the populations. But I dare say it sounds like there's going to be so many of them. It sounds like with all of this excellent feeding opportunity, should we expect to see a real boost in breeding of many different kinds of water birds?
Well, and last week I was with a birdwatching group out in West New South Wales, and all of the lakes and rivers are full of water in inland New South Wales. But they'll tend to dry out relatively quickly. And Lake George will keep its water for at least several seasons. So what will happen is we'll end up with Lake George with full of water, and Lake Burley Griffin too, for that matter, as inland New South Wales dries out over the next 12 months to 2 years. What that means is that the vast numbers of birds that are breeding out there right now, birds like pelicans, birds like terns, birds like swans, they'll all need somewhere to go. And what I would be expecting is that Lake George will become a huge refuge for hundreds, if not thousands, of pelicans over the next 2 years.
Neil Hermes is with us, the president of the Canberra Ornithologist Group, talking about the impact on the bird life in particular, but the wildlife with a full Lake George for not just one season, but a few now consecutively. Neil, I wonder how important is that opportunity for a really strong breeding season for these birds, given that, as we've discussed before all of this wet, it was a very long period of a very harsh drought.
Okay, so let's take pelicans for example. Pelicans have a long lived. They breed spasmodically in normal seasons. They'll nest in small colonies. Maybe a few hundred birds will try and nest in a particular area. Right now, because of the conditions in inland New South Wales, there's one colony that's estimated at 30,000 pelicans nesting on one lake.
Oh, wow.
Now that's huge. Now those chicks, when they hatch, if those inland waters then dry up, they're going to need places to feed. They're the birds that are going to. They're not migrating. They're just wandering. They're looking for places to find food. Some of these birds will end up at Lake George. Some will end up on Lake Burley-Griffin. Some of them could end up in places like New Zealand, and that's what happens after these big booms. They'll spread out all across the Pacific looking for islands where there's water. There's been records on Norfolk Island and Vanuatu under these sort of circumstances. So the pelicans are desperate to find places for food, and they will do well then for a number of years until we then have another dry period and the populations drop away. And then, we'll go through a drought. The pelicans will then hang on in small numbers before they then have these huge breeding events again.
You mentioned at the outset that, of course, a wet Lake George is good for some species, dry is when we see others. Eagles, I think, were one of the things you mentioned there. Is this actually a tougher season for them? Have they been forced elsewhere if there's a lot of water in Lake George?
Yes, and this is, again, more broadly across New South Wales. Wet seasons are really good for some species and not so good for other species. Areas where, we would have seen as birdwatchers dry country birds like chats, for example, crimson chats and yellow chats, white-fronted chats, beautiful birds on these inland plains last week. They're underwater, and it's marsh terns and herons that are breeding. So one group of birds has been displaced by another, and the ones that are displaced will have to find other areas in the meantime until their regular areas dry out. So Australia is very much like that. That's how our climate works, and the birds have adapted over thousands of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, to that sort of boom and bust condition. And these young pelicans that are just coming out of Lake Brewster now, many of them won't survive. Many of them will find it difficult to find a place to hang in there, and Lake George may be exactly the place that they need to find for them to become adults and join the breeding population.
So does all this make it a pretty rich and busy time for birders like you, Neil? Is there lots to see by the sounds of things?
Absolutely. We had a ball in Western New South Wales last week, seeing all these changes that are occurring, and the vast numbers of particularly things like terns. There's species of freshwater terns in Australia that, like gulls, they're an inland bird, and they're doing enormously well. Birds that we would rarely see, and I expect to see some of those birds turning up around Canberra in the next year or two. And there's a prediction on ABC Radio this afternoon.
Well, hold you to it, Neil.
Hold me to it.
How will we know if they're here? How can we recognise these terns?
Well, the terns are a bit like a gull. People would know terns from the coast, the birds that feed along the coast and are a seabird. But we have these ones that are freshwater terns, and they've got long pointed wings. They're a white colour, long pointed bill. They dive into the water for small fish. We will get them around Lake Burley-Griffin without a doubt in the next year or so, and at Lake George.
Lots to look forward to then, hopefully. Neil, happy bird watching and spotting to you.
Thank very much, Anna.
Thank you.
And happy bird watching to you too. Cheers.
Thank you so much. It's Neil Hermes, president of the Canberra Ornithologists Group, who have plenty to see just at the minute. You don't even have to be a special observer just to see the pelicans on Lake George at the moment. Extraordinary numbers of birds. And as you heard from Neil, hopefully some more exciting ones to come.